Jack had always been a man of few words. The ranch, nestled in the far stretches of the quiet plains, was his entire world. Every morning he woke up to the sound of wind blowing through the tall grasses, the chirping of birds and the distant lowing of cattle. It was a peaceful life, but one that was isolated and solitary. For years, Jack had lived alone, the vast land his only company. The only connection he had to the outside world was the occasional visit to town for supplies, but even then, he kept to himself. People, he thought, were just another complication. But all of that changed one autumn afternoon when Eliza wandered onto his property. She didn't look like the type of person who would end up in a place like this. Jack couldn't remember the last time he'd seen anyone who looked so out of place. Eliza was young, maybe in her early 30s, with bright eyes and an energy that seemed to sparkle around her. She had recently moved to the nearby town to escape her past, and on that day, she had taken a walk that led her to the edge of Jack's land. At first, Jack didn't notice her approach. He was busy repairing the fence that had been knocked down during the last storm. The ranch had its fair share of troubles, but Jack never complained. He simply worked through them one task at a time. It wasn't until he heard a soft voice calling out that he looked up. "Excuse me," Eliza said. Her voice was tentative, almost as if she wasn't sure if she should be speaking to him. "I was wondering if you could help me." Jack froze for a moment. It wasn't the request that surprised him. He'd been asked for help before, but it was rare. What surprised him was the way she stood there, not in the usual way people did when they approached him. Most people stood a bit wary, unsure of the rancher who rarely smiled. But Eliza stood with a confidence that didn't belong in this lonely place. It made Jack feel a bit unsettled. "Help?" Jack asked, his voice low as he wiped his hands on his worn jeans. "Yeah," she said, glancing at the fence Jack had been working on. "I'm not exactly sure how to fix this fence near my place. I was hoping you might know how to do it." For a moment, Jack just stared at her. She seemed so out of place here, and yet, there was something about her that felt familiar, like a quiet breeze on a hot day. She was asking for something simple, just a little help. But to Jack, it felt like more. He had been alone for so long, living by his own rules, that the idea of letting someone into his world seemed foreign. He took a deep breath. "I can help with that," he said. "Follow me." Jack didn't expect her to follow. Most people didn't. They often hesitated before venturing too far onto the ranch. But Eliza didn't hesitate. She simply smiled and followed him toward the area she'd pointed out. As they worked together on the fence, Jack couldn't help but notice how easy it felt to be around her. It was strange. She was different from anyone he'd ever met, but in a way, it was refreshing. She didn't ask questions about his past or try to dig into his life. Instead, she simply talked about her own, telling him how she had moved to the town recently, trying to start fresh after some difficult times. For a brief moment, Jack let his guard down. He listened to her speak about her life, though he didn't share anything about his own. He didn't feel the need to. She didn't push, and that made him feel comfortable. It wasn't until the job was done and they were standing in the fading light of the afternoon that he felt a shift between them. "Thank you," Eliza said, brushing her hands on her jeans. "I really appreciate it." "I didn't expect you to come out all this way for a fence." Jack nodded, though he didn't quite know what to say. He hadn't expected to enjoy her company. The days of quiet and solitude had made him forget what it felt like to have someone around. To be needed, even for something as simple as fixing a fence. "Don't mention it," he muttered, turning away. But as he walked back to the ranch house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel quite as alone. The next few days were quiet as usual. Jack returned to his daily routine, taking care of the cattle and working on repairs around the ranch. But something was different. He found himself thinking about Eliza. She hadn't just been some stranger passing through. There was something in her eyes that lingered, something that spoke of a kind of vulnerability that Jack hadn't seen in a long time. Eliza didn't visit again immediately. Jack thought maybe that would be the end of it. It wasn't unusual for people to stop by and ask for help, but then disappear just as quickly. He had seen it all before. But a few days later, as Jack was working on another part of the property, he heard her voice again. "Jack?" He turned and saw Eliza walking toward him. She had a small bag slung over her shoulder, and she looked like she was about to say something important. "I was wondering if you needed help with anything today," she asked, her eyes hopeful. Jack was taken aback. Most people didn't offer to help him. It was always him doing the helping. It was what he was used to. But here she was offering to help him. "I'm good for now," Jack replied gruffly, trying not to let the warmth that suddenly surged inside him show. "Just taking care of things." Eliza nodded, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made Jack pause. It wasn't pity or concern. It was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Well, if you change your mind," she said with a smile, "I'll be at my place." Jack watched her walk away, and this time, he couldn't shake the feeling of connection between them. He didn't understand it, and he didn't know what it meant. But something had shifted in him. He found himself looking forward to their next meeting, even if he didn't know why. The days began to blur together, each one filled with the routine work that Jack had grown so used to. The morning started early with the sun rising over the horizon, the faint glow spilling over the dry plains. Jack would step out of his small ranch house, breathing in the crisp, cool air. He could hear the familiar sounds of nature, the wind rustling the leaves, the distant moo of cattle, and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was a rhythm that had been the same for years, and Jack liked it that way. But for the first time in a long while, something felt different. Something had shifted, and it had started with Eliza. He thought about her more often than he cared to admit. He remembered the way she looked at him that day they worked together on the fence. She didn't seem intimidated by him as most people were. Instead, she had treated him like a person, not some mysterious figure from a distant world. She had listened when he spoke, even if it was just a few words here and there, and somehow, that felt more real than any conversation he'd had in years. Despite himself, Jack found that he was looking forward to seeing her again. He had convinced himself that it was just the loneliness of the ranch playing tricks on him. After all, Eliza had only stopped by to ask for help with the fence, right? It wasn't like she wanted to become a part of his life. Still, when she didn't show up the next day, Jack couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment. The following afternoon, when the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Jack was out by the barn mending a broken latch. He was so focused on the task at hand that he didn't hear the sound of footsteps approaching, until it was almost too late. "Hey, Jack!" Eliza's voice called out again, startling him for a moment. Jack straightened up, his heart inexplicably quickening. He hadn't expected her to return so soon. "Hi, Eliza," he said, turning toward her. She was standing at the edge of the barn, smiling as she waved. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by," she said casually. There was an ease about her that made Jack feel like she had done this 1,000 times, when in reality this was only the second time they had crossed paths. She walked closer, and Jack couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to see her standing there. She wasn't like most people who passed through. There was no awkwardness in her presence, no uncomfortable silence. It felt almost as though she belonged there, like she had always been a part of the land that stretched before them. "I was hoping I could offer to help again," Eliza continued, glancing at the tools in Jack's hands. "You've been so kind to help me before, I thought maybe I could return the favor." Jack hesitated for a moment, not used to anyone offering help, especially not someone as kind and genuine as Eliza. He had spent so many years doing everything on his own that the idea of letting someone else pitch in felt strange. But the sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. "Sure, I suppose I could use a hand," Jack replied gruffly, trying to keep his voice from betraying the rush of unexpected emotions he was feeling. Eliza smiled widely, her eyes lighting up as if she had just won a small victory. "Great, what can I do?" They worked together in silence for a while, Jack taking the lead, showing Eliza how to handle the tools. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, and she seemed to enjoy the work, her easygoing nature making everything feel more relaxed. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, Jack found himself speaking more than he usually did. It wasn't much, but he shared a few stories about his life on the ranch, how he had inherited it from his father, how it had been passed down through the generations. He didn't talk about his past much, but with Eliza, something was different. She didn't push him to open up. She just listened, and for some reason that felt easier than it had in a long time. "So," Eliza said after a while, "what's it like living out here all alone?" Jack's hand paused mid-motion as he worked. It was a question he had avoided for years, one he had learned to deflect with a simple shrug or a quick change of subject. But for some reason, Eliza's question didn't feel like an invasion of privacy. It felt more like an invitation. "It's peaceful," Jack said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Quiet, mostly. Sometimes it feels like I'm the only one left in the world." Eliza nodded as if she understood. "That sounds nice," she said quietly. "I've always been surrounded by noise. It's a bit overwhelming at times." Jack glanced at her. There was something in her eyes, a sadness maybe, or something she wasn't ready to share. But Jack didn't press her. It wasn't his place to ask. They both had their reasons for keeping certain things hidden. The evening passed quickly, the two of them working side by side. As they finished the task, Jack felt a strange sense of contentment wash over him. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd missed, being around someone who didn't expect anything from him, someone who didn't try to pry into his life. As they stood there, looking out over the land, the sky now painted with the vibrant colors of sunset, Eliza broke the silence. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think I could get used to this. The quiet, the open air. It's a nice change from the city." Jack didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't know much about the city life she had come from, but he understood the desire for peace. The ranch had always offered him that, even if it came with the price of isolation. "I suppose you could," Jack said, his voice low. "But it's not for everyone." Eliza laughed softly. "I guess you're right. But it's still nice to dream about." They stood there for a few more minutes, just watching the sky shift from orange to deep purple. There was a quiet understanding between them, a connection that didn't need words. "Well," Eliza said, breaking the silence, "I should probably get going. I don't want to be a bother." "You're not a bother," Jack replied quickly. "Not at all." Eliza smiled, and for a moment it seemed like the whole world was a little bit brighter. As she turned to leave, Jack found himself watching her walk away. He wasn't sure why it felt different this time. It wasn't like he had never seen someone leave before, but something about her presence left a mark on him. As she disappeared over the hill, Jack stood there for a while longer, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't used to these feelings, this sense of connection, of wanting to see someone again. But there was no denying it now. Jack wanted Eliza to come back. The days that followed were filled with the familiar routine Jack had always known. But now there was something new. Each morning, as the sun crept over the horizon and painted the sky with soft hues of pink and gold, Jack found his thoughts drifting to Eliza. He never expected her to become such a part of his daily life, but there she was, always in his thoughts like a quiet, constant presence. For the first time in years, Jack noticed the loneliness that had once been so comfortable. He had always prided himself on living alone, on being self-sufficient, but now he wondered if there was more to life than just surviving. Eliza had shown him something he hadn't realized he missed, the simple joy of companionship, of having someone to share the silence with. Eliza had been back to the ranch a few times since their first meeting. Each visit they worked together on something, whether it was mending fences or fixing up the barn. Jack didn't mind the extra help. In fact, it was refreshing to have someone by his side. Eliza, with her easy smile and quiet confidence, seemed to fit into his world in a way Jack hadn't anticipated. She didn't question his solitude, nor did she try to change him. She simply accepted him for who he was. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Eliza stayed longer than usual. The sun had set and the air had turned cool. Jack was sitting on the porch the quiet evening, stretching out before him. The smell of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air, and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees created a sense of calm. Eliza was sitting next to him, not saying much but not needing to. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt natural, like they had been doing this for years. After a while, Eliza spoke, her voice soft but serious. "Jack," she began, looking out at the stars beginning to twinkle above them, "do you ever think about what it would be like if things were different?" Jack turned his head to look at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Different how?" "You know," she continued, her gaze still on the sky, "if you didn't live out here by yourself, if you had someone to share all this with." Jack didn't answer right away. The question hung in the air, and he felt a mix of emotions rush through him. He wasn't used to talking about things like this. He had always kept his thoughts and feelings locked away, hidden behind his work and his quiet existence. But Eliza had a way of making him question everything he had built his life around. "I've never really thought about it," he said finally, his voice low, as if the words were more for himself than for her. "I suppose it never mattered much." Eliza glanced at him then, her eyes soft. "I think it matters more than you realize." There was a pause, and Jack could feel the weight of her words. He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to opening up to anyone, especially not about his life. But with Eliza, it felt different. She didn't ask for much, just his honesty. For the first time, Jack found himself wanting to share something, to let down the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself. He hadn't realized how lonely he had become until Eliza came into his life. She made him question his choices, his solitude, and for some reason, he felt comfortable with that. "I suppose," Jack began slowly, "I've always been afraid of getting too close to anyone. People always leave, you know. I've seen it happen too many times." Eliza didn't interrupt him. She simply waited, her presence steady beside him. "It's easier this way," he continued. "If I don't get too close, then it doesn't hurt when they leave." He could feel Eliza's gaze on him, but he didn't dare look at her. He wasn't sure what he would see in her eyes, pity perhaps, or disappointment. But when he finally glanced at her, he didn't see either of those things. Instead, there was understanding. It was as if Eliza had been through something similar, though she hadn't spoken about her own past. "I get it," she said softly, "but sometimes letting people in doesn't mean they're going to leave. It means you can find something worth holding on to." Jack wasn't sure what to make of her words. They were foreign to him. He had never been one to hold on to anything. His whole life had been about letting go, moving on, and keeping his emotions in check. But Eliza was different. She made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. The evening stretched on, and they continued to sit in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. For Jack, the quiet felt heavier now. Eliza's words lingered in his mind like a gentle tug at his heart. As the days passed, their connection grew stronger. Jack found himself looking forward to her visits more than he cared to admit. She had a way of making the mundane feel special, of turning ordinary tasks into something more meaningful. Whether they were fixing the barn roof or simply sitting together in the quiet of the evening, Jack felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known he was missing. But there was still something holding him back. He couldn't shake the fear that had been with him for so long, the fear that letting someone in would only lead to pain. Eliza had become a bright spot in his life, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to let her see all of him, the parts of him that had been buried deep for so many years. One evening, as they finished up another long day of work, Eliza looked at him with a smile that made Jack's heart skip a beat. "You know," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time for me to make a decision about staying here for real." Jack turned to her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not just passing through anymore," Eliza said, her tone serious. "I like it here. I like being around you. I think I could make a life here." Her words hit Jack like a wave crashing over him. He wasn't sure how to respond. His mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. The idea of Eliza staying in his world, of her being a permanent part of his life, was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'm not sure if I'm ready for that," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not the kind of person who makes it easy for others to get close." Eliza didn't flinch at his words. She simply nodded as if she understood. "I know," she said softly, "but maybe that's something we can work on together." Jack stood there, his heart pounding. He had always thought he was better off alone. But now, with Eliza standing in front of him, offering a chance at something more, he wasn't so sure. As the evening darkened around them, Jack realized that he was facing a decision he had been avoiding for years. Whether to let someone in, to take the risk of loving and being loved, or to continue living in the safety of solitude. And for the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't sure which choice he would make. The days seemed to stretch longer as Jack found himself caught between his fears and his growing feelings for Eliza. Each morning, when the sun peeked over the horizon, Jack went about his daily chores with the usual determination. But now something inside him stirred with each task he did. The familiar rhythm of the ranch seemed less comforting than before. Eliza's presence lingered in his mind, and the silence that once felt peaceful now seemed empty without her. It wasn't that Jack didn't appreciate her company. He did. In fact, he had never realized how much he had missed the simple act of sharing time with another person. But there was a hesitation in him, a fear that kept him from fully opening up. Every time Eliza got too close, he could feel the walls he had built around himself start to tremble, and that terrified him. One evening, as Jack was finishing up some work around the barn, he saw Eliza walking toward him from a distance. It had been a few days since they had last spoken seriously about their lives, about what it meant to be together. Jack had been avoiding it, hiding behind the excuse of work and routine. But tonight, as the evening light bathed the ranch in soft golds and reds, he knew the time for avoiding the conversation was running out. Eliza walked up to him with that same easy smile, but there was something different about the way she carried herself. It was as though she had made up her mind about something, though Jack couldn't quite figure out what. "Jack," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk." Jack's heart sank a little, knowing that this conversation was coming. He wiped his hands on his jeans and turned to face her, trying to keep his face neutral. "I know," he replied. His voice was quiet, almost too quiet for his liking. He had a million things running through his mind, but he couldn't find the words to say them. His mouth felt dry, and for the first time in a long while he felt unsure of himself. "I've been thinking about what you said," Eliza continued, her gaze steady on his, "about how you don't let anyone in, about how you're afraid of people leaving." She paused as though carefully weighing her next words. "And I get it, I do. But I also think that if you keep holding on to that fear, you're going to miss out on something that could be really good for you." For us, Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. His mind was spinning. Eliza was right, of course. He had been holding back for so long, afraid of what it would mean to let someone into his world, to let them see the parts of him he had buried deep. But the thought of her leaving, of her walking away because he couldn't open up, hurt in a way he hadn't expected. "I'm not good at this," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been good at letting people in. It's easier to just keep things the way they are. It's safer." Eliza took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Maybe," she said softly, "but safety doesn't make you happy. It just keeps you comfortable, and comfort isn't enough when you want something more." Jack looked down at his boots, trying to collect his thoughts. He had spent so much of his life guarding himself, hiding behind the walls he had built. It had worked to an extent, but now, with Eliza standing in front of him, offering a chance at something different, he realized that his safety net had become a cage. "I don't know how to do this," Jack said quietly. "I don't know how to let someone in without pushing them away." Eliza reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, reassuring. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said. "You just have to try. I'm not going anywhere, Jack. I'm here. And I'm not asking you to change everything overnight. I just want you to take a step. Just one step." Jack felt his chest tighten as the weight of her words settled over him. He had spent so long hiding, so long afraid to let anyone see him for who he truly was. And now here was Eliza, offering him a chance to open up, to be vulnerable without judgment. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was simply asking for him to try. "I don't want to hurt you," Jack said, his voice filled with quiet desperation. "I don't want to mess things up." "You won't," Eliza replied, her voice calm and steady. "But you have to let me in first. You have to let me see the real you." Jack closed his eyes for a moment, taking in a deep breath. He could feel the fear rising in his chest, the familiar feeling of wanting to retreat. But this time, something inside him fought against it. Something inside him knew that he couldn't keep running, not when Eliza had already shown him a glimpse of something better. He opened his eyes and looked at her. There was no turning back now. He had to make a choice. "I don't know what the future holds," Jack said, his voice a little rough, "but I want to find out with you." Eliza smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that made Jack feel like he had just made the right choice. "That's all I'm asking for," she said softly. They stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them, but the tension slowly melting away. Jack felt a sense of relief that he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure what the future would bring. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let his fear hold him back anymore. Eliza took a step closer, her hand still resting gently on his arm. "We can take it slow," she said, her voice full of warmth. "One step at a time. No pressure, just us. Jack nodded, feeling a sense of hope rise within him. Maybe this wasn't as scary as he had thought. Maybe letting someone in wasn't the end of everything he had known. Maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something new. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in soft, fading light, Jack felt a shift inside him. He wasn't sure what the future would look like, but he knew he was ready to find out. With Eliza by his side, he could finally face the fear that had kept him from living fully. And for the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. The days after their conversation were filled with a quiet, unexpected peace. Jack wasn't sure what to call it, this feeling that settled in his chest whenever Eliza was near. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something warm and real that he hadn't known he was missing. He had spent so many years believing that solitude was his only option, but now as the days passed he realized just how wrong he had been. Eliza had kept her promise. She hadn't pushed him to change overnight. Instead, she simply kept showing up, each day bringing a new kind of connection between them. They spent their time working together, repairing the barn, fixing the fences, and taking care of the cattle. The tasks were no longer as burdensome as they once seemed. In fact, they felt almost easy with Eliza by his side. Her laughter, her simple presence, filled the silence of the ranch in a way Jack hadn't thought was possible. One morning after a long stretch of hard work, Jack found himself standing in the yard looking out over the land. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the ranch. He took in a deep breath, savoring the fresh air that was beginning to warm with the new day. There was a quiet peace in the world around him, and for the first time in years, Jack felt like he was truly a part of it. Eliza appeared from the house, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She walked toward him with a smile, the kind of smile that made Jack feel like everything was falling into place, even if it was still a bit uncertain. "Morning," she greeted, her voice soft but full of warmth. Jack turned to face her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Morning," he replied. They stood there for a few moments in silence, just watching the day unfold. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. It felt natural, like they didn't need words to fill the space between them. "I've been thinking," Eliza said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. "Maybe it's time for me to stop just visiting. Maybe it's time for me to make this my home. For real." Jack glanced at her surprised. He had expected her to mention the idea before, but hearing her say it out loud made something shift in him. There was no hesitation in her voice, no fear. She was ready to take that step. It was a bold move, and part of Jack was scared to take it with her. He had spent so long protecting himself from the possibility of loss, but now, with Eliza standing before him, he realized that maybe the risk was worth it. "You're sure?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I'm sure. I've never felt more at home than I do here with you." Her words settled in his heart like a gentle weight, and for a moment, Jack felt like he could finally breathe. He had always kept a safe distance from people, from life, but Eliza had shown him something different. She had shown him that living wasn't just about keeping safe, it was about taking chances, about letting people in, about finding joy in the simple moments. Jack's heart was still uncertain, still carrying the weight of past scars, but as he looked at Eliza, something inside him told him that he didn't have to carry those scars alone anymore. He had spent so much time running from the possibility of being hurt, but in doing so, he had also run from the chance of truly living. "I don't know if I'm ready to be anyone's everything," Jack said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've never been good at that. But I want to try." Eliza reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be anyone's everything. You just have to be you, and that's enough for me." Her words wrapped around Jack like a warm embrace, and he realized that it wasn't perfection that mattered. It was honesty. It was presence. It was the willingness to take that first step into something unknown. It was letting someone else see you for who you truly were without fear. He nodded slowly, a sense of peace settling over him. "Okay, let's do this." The words felt right even though they were new. Jack knew there was still a lot to figure out, a lot of fears to face. But for the first time, he wasn't facing them alone, and that made all the difference. As the days passed, Jack and Eliza continued to grow closer. They worked side by side, their bond strengthening with each shared moment. Jack slowly began to open up more, sharing stories from his past, the ones he had kept locked away for so long. Eliza listened without judgment, offering him comfort and understanding. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eliza turned to Jack with a smile. "I'm glad I stayed," she said softly. Jack's heart swelled at her words, and he realized how much he had come to depend on her presence. It wasn't just that she had filled the empty spaces in his life. It was that she had shown him a new way to live, a way that involved trusting, sharing, and being vulnerable. He had thought that living alone would keep him safe, but it had only kept him isolated. "I'm glad you stayed too," Jack said, his voice full of sincerity. "You've changed everything for me." Eliza smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made Jack feel like he wasn't alone anymore. "We've changed each other," she said quietly. And in that moment, Jack realized just how true her words were. They had both come to the ranch for different reasons. Eliza seeking a fresh start, and Jack wanting to keep his distance from the world. But somewhere along the way, they had found something unexpected: each other. Jack didn't know what the future would hold. There were still uncertainties, still fears to face. But as he sat there beside Eliza, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, he realized that for the first time in years, he was ready to face whatever came next, because with Eliza by his side, he didn't have to face it alone.